Today we're going to be taking a look at contrast, which is essentially about thinking about differences and how to create visual interest by including something in your composition that is different from something else. All right, so by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to define the idea of contrast in art. You should be able to identify and describe how different elements of art can be contrasted. And most importantly, you should be becoming more aware of how you can apply the concept of contrast to your own work in order to be able to create even more visual interest in your pieces. Okay? So, what is contrast? So, most often we actually end up thinking of this in relationship to the element of value, right? Where we think about the difference between light values or tints and highlights versus dark values, which are the shades and shadows. Right, but realistically speaking, we can actually use this term contrast to talk about differences of other elements as well. Right, so really, contrast is about the idea of creating visual opposition between two things within an artwork in order to help some part of the composition to stand out even more. Right, so we have contrast of line. Right, so we've talked about this in other videos, but we have different line types. So we could contrast the sketchy versus the fluid. We can contrast the qualities of the vertical versus diagonal, the sharp versus the curvy, etc. Right. So in this image from the Far East, we can see that there is a whole lot of line being used and in very, very different ways, right? We have some solid lines, we have some broken lines, we have lots of changes in direction where there's some fairly dominant sort of diagonals contrasted against some fairly strong verticals over here on the one side, right? And just by manipulating the different types of line that we're using, we're able to create additional interest in a piece of work. Secondly, we can take a look at contrast of shapes, right? We know already that there are two basic overall categories of shapes. We have the geometric, right? Those ones that we can name and we can identify versus the organic, which are kind of that free-flowing and more fluid enclosed area, right? So we can incorporate different shapes within an artwork as well in order to help create that idea of emphasis. Right, we also have contrast of form, right? When we take a look at essential concepts of forms of static versus dynamic, right? So in these two examples, we have the same subject matter by two different artists and their treatment is totally different. And when we put these images side by side, we can clearly see the contrast of the treatment of form in these two pieces, right? Where Konstantin Brancusi's work is extremely static. It's so still. And it is very closed, right? There's a strong rigidity about it, whereas with Rodin's work, with the more representational, more realistic forms, right, we have this kind of dynamic energy. There's a little bit more passion involved, right? And by treating the form differently, we're able to create different sets of emotions in our work. Right? Of course, we can also contrast color, right? So we need to make sure that we're thinking about the three primary attributes of color, which are hue, saturation, and value, right? And we can contrast how we are using hues, complementary colors. We can contrast saturation, the really pure colors versus the desaturated, and we can contrast value as we had mentioned before, the tints versus the shades. But we can also start thinking about different color schemes that we could be using as well, right? A warm color scheme versus a cool color scheme, a neutral color scheme versus a bright accented neutral scheme as well, right? So there's different ways that we can play around with color in order to make something pop and to stand out. Right, we have contrast of texture, right, and this will often help direct our attention to a particular part of a sculptural piece, right? So in this particular example from Mesopotamia, right, we see that the overall surface texture is fairly smooth, but then suddenly the hair is highly textured and makes us want to look at that particular part of the composition with greater detail. Right, and of course we also have contrast of value, right? That whole idea of light versus dark. We've talked about chiaroscuro in other videos, and the variety of different flat lighting, right? And how is it that we choose to light our subjects in order to create visual interest and how to make something stand out, right? We also have contrast of space, right? And again, we're coming back to this idea of things that are in opposition to each other, right? So we have the vast amounts of negative space in this particular work by Kara Walker. It's fairly empty, but we could also see that one area of the composition is a little bit more congested. There's not a lot of land where the two figures are kind of kissing and having that intimate moment on the left side, right? So there's different ways that we can go through and we can take a look at how to create contrast of space as well, right? Of course, we can also play around with the size. We can enlarge, we can shrink, we can look macroscopically or microscopically, right? And in this particular piece by Rene Magritte, we're starting to see how a contrast of scale kind of creates this very surreal environment, right? Because the comb and the glass are so disproportionate in contrast with some of the other elements that are within the room that kind of create that sense of a believable space, right? And by contrasting scale, we're kind of disrupting some of our expectations. Okay? So contrast is really this idea of setting things in opposition to each other. And by doing so, not only are we able to visually emphasize something, but we're also able to create sort of a visual disturbance in such a way in order to make us think differently about what it is that we expect to see in an artwork. Contrast is an essential principle of design because it helps to bring something to our attention. And that is one of the main goals of the visual artist, is to bring attention to a topic, to an issue, to an idea, to their audience. All right, so hopefully you have an idea of what contrast is and how it can be used. Maybe you're getting some ideas of how it might be incorporated into your own work. If you have any questions, please make sure that you're asking, and best of luck with your next creative adventure. Take care. Bye.